Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be introducing the concept of file I/O, or file input and output. Specifically, we're going to be going over what file I/O is, and as part of that discussion, we're going to be talking about what file permissions are, which is something you may be familiar with, especially if you've used Linux or Unix platform. We're also going to be going over the different methods used to basically read from files, and the first method we're going to talk about is called fopen, which is a built-in function of PHP, and as part of that we're going to provide a discussion of specifying file paths to that function and also the different access modes that you can specify to the function that describe basically whether you want to open a file to read or write, for example. We're going to go over the concept of file pointers, which is very similar to an array cursor, which is basically allows you to read or write from a certain point in a document based on where this particular pointer is. And then we're going to go over a couple of other methods that relate to working with files. fget is a way of reading a single line from a file. feof is basically a function that tests if your file pointer is at the end of a file. And we're going to explain more about that. And then we're going to go over the fclose method, which is a way, sort of the analog to fopen, which is a way to close a particular file. And we're also going to talk about the trim function, which is something that is useful when working with files. So basically, file I/O, or file input and output, refers to reading from and writing to files on a file system. PHP fortunately provides a number of built-in functions for doing so. And in order to perform file I/O, there's typically 3 steps involved. The first step is you open a connection or you open a particular file. Then what you do is you perform any read or write operations that you need to on that particular file. And when you're done with those operations, you close the file. And so we're going to talk about, we're going to actually, as we go through this lesson, walk through each of these different steps. One thing to note about opening a file is that when you open a file, we'll be learning you need to specify whether you intend to just read or write from that particular file. Now I want to talk about file permissions. Like I said, those of you that have used Unix or Linux systems are more familiar with this than probably Windows users. But basically, in order to read or write from or to a particular file, you need to have the appropriate permissions on that file. For example, to read from a file, you need to have what's known as read permissions on the file. To write to a file, you need to have write permissions on the file. And basically what these are permissions that are set by the particular operating system on the system that you're using. So for our local development environment, it's going to be a Windows permission system. If you're developing, typically if you're using a web host, they typically use a Linux server. It's going to be dealing with Linux as permission systems for read and write permissions. One of the things to note is that not having the proper file permissions for a particular file is one of the most common errors in trying to do file I/O with PHP. If you're trying to read from a file and you don't have read permission, or write from a file and you don't have permission to write on the file. Now, the way things that typically with an operating system, the way permissions work is they're associated with a particular user account. For example, in Windows, when you log onto your computer, that's your user account. And you have certain read and write permissions for different directories and different files. Typically, you always have, for example, read and write permission for all of the directories and files within your user directory. So when using PHP, one thing to note that you may encounter as a problem is that PHP, when it typically runs, when that PHP interpreter runs on your server, it typically runs as a PHP user account or as a web user account. So you have to make sure that the account associated with the PHP interpreter, and this is something that you may be able to change, or it's something that you have to talk to your system admin about, but that user account has to have the proper permission set to access to read or write for a particular file. So basically, if PHP is trying to open a file for reading, whatever user that PHP interpreter process is running at needs to have permission to read or write from that particular file. So the first step in working with a file in PHP is to open the file for reading or writing, and you do that using what's known as the fopen function. It's a built-in function in PHP, and it takes two required parameters. The first one is the name and the path to the file that you're going to be opening. The second is what's known as the read and write mode with which to open the file. So as mentioned, when you open a file, you have to let PHP and the operating system know whether you intend to just read from the file, write from the file, or do both. If fopen on a particular file is successful, it returns what's known as a file handle. And basically what a file handle is it represents a open connection to that particular file. In PHP, a file handle is actually one of the special PHP data types, the other one being null, that's known as a resource data type. Basically what it is it's a data type that refers to an external resource, in this case a handle to an open file. Another example of a resource data type might be a connection to a MySQL database. If fopen fails, it returns false, and then it generates an e-warning level error. And so that's something we're going to talk a little bit about working with, how to handle that error when you use the fopen function. And this is a key function because a valid file handle is needed by all of the other PHP file I/O functions that we're going to be dealing with. Because basically what you do is when you call a function, for example, to read a line from a file, you have to pass it a valid file handle, and that valid file handle means that it's a open handle to an opened PHP file. So this is really a key function. If we actually go and look at php.net and the documentation for the fopen function, we can see it has these two required parameters, file name and mode. Mode being the basically the read-write mode that you use to open a particular file. And actually, if you look down here, you can see with mode there's a number of different options that you can use to open a file. You can open it to read, open it to write. We're going to go over that a little more in a second. So file paths, as we saw, the first parameter to the fopen function is a file name parameter. And basically, you have to provide a path to the file that you want to open. And that can be a relative path or an absolute path, depending on the situation. And a couple things to notice about how to specify the paths. In Windows, you may know that paths are typically separated by the / character. And on a Unix system, they're actually separated by a / character. So when you're specifying the path to a file in the fopen function, on a Windows system, it actually lets you use either /s to specify the path, or / to specify the path. In order to specify a / within a PHP string literal, you actually have to escape it. So you'll notice that for each / you actually have two / characters. On a Unix system, which is maybe what your web host is going to be using, file paths are denoted with the / characters. One thing to note is that basically for the maximum code portability, you should always use / even when working on a Windows environment. For example, if this was specified, let's say this was just the path right here. This path is a relative path because it uses /s. If we move the file that move the application that uses this particular path to a Windows machine to a Unix machine, the relative path would still work because the / character can be used for both Windows and on Unix. Now that said, if we had instead used the / character to specify the path, and here I'm eliminating the escape character, now when if we move our application to a Linux system, it's not going to be able to find that file in a relative path because of the / character. So file access modes are basically it's the second parameter to the fopen function, and it's a 1 to 2 character string that basically tells PHP whether you want to open a file for reading, writing, or both. And there's a couple other different options that you can do as well. One thing to note is that in order to open a file for reading or writing, you actually have to have the proper permissions for that, as we had talked about. So you can request PHP to, for example, to open a file to read, but if you don't have read permission on that file, you're not going to be able to do that. And actually, if we go back and look at the documentation for fopen, you can see In the function documentation, the function reference, there are a number of different modes that you can specify. You can specify the character R, which is what we're going to be using in today's lesson, a lowercase r that says you're basically just opening the file to read, and you want the file pointer, which we're going to get to be placed at the beginning of the file. You can use a W that says we're going to open the file for write. There's modes for appending to the end of the file and creating a new file and so forth. We're going to talk more about those when we get to the lesson on writing to files. So let's actually go take a look at some sample code that we have. There's a file called fopen.php, and basically we're going to use the fopen function in a couple of different ways to show how it's used. We're basically going to be opening a file called in a data directory that's in the data directory of the directory that fopen.php is contained in. So fopen.php is in one directory. Then within that directory, there's another subdirectory called data. So, for example, if we look at our lecture 3 examples, we can see we have a fopen file, and then within that, there's a subdirectory called data that contains a file called stocks.txt. And this is the file that we're going to be trying to open. And stocks.txt, if we actually look at it, is a little terse, and we're going to explain more about that when we get to a future example. But it basically is our way of, for example, representing the the current stock for different items in a particular store. For right now, we're just going to work with opening the file. And the first way we're going to do that is by using a relative path. So we specify a string called relpath that specifies a relative path to stock.txt. And as you can see, it's in the data subdirectory where this fopen.php file is actually located. And then here we call the fopen function. We pass it the path name, or the path to the file, which is a relative path in this case, and we pass it the access mode R, which says we want to open the file for reading. Then, basically, as we mentioned, if fopen does not work, what it will do is it will return false, saying that it was there was an error opening the file. So we test. It says if file handle is false, we're going to output an error message that says there was an error opening the file. And if it successfully opens it, we're going to output a message that says the file was successfully opened for reading. Down here, we have another example that does the same thing, except we're going to basically use an absolute path in the fopen function. So instead of providing a relative path, we're going to provide an absolute path. In this case, we define our absolute path using the server document root superglobal array value, and then we're actually adding the specific path to our stock.txt file. And as you can see, the same function call is made, except we use this apps path variable, which has an absolute path. And again, we're going to test if there was an error opening the file, and if so, we're going to output an error message, and if not, we're going to say that the file was successfully opened for reading. So if we actually go and load this script in our browser, go to fopen.php, we can see a couple things. We can see fopen using relative path, and what it does is it says the file, and it shows the relative path of that file was successfully opened for reading. So we were able to open that file correctly. And then down here, when we use the absolute path, our output is the file, and this is the absolute path to stock.txt. It says that file was successfully opened for reading. So we can see here an example of using both an absolute and relative path with fopen. There's actually a third example in this file in which we try to generate an error using fopen to show how that handles an error. So for example, we're going to try to open a path to open a file called stock.csv, which is an extension used for comma-separated value files, if you might have heard of it. It doesn't matter if you have or haven't, but what you'll notice is that in our data directory, data subdirectory, in which fopen.php is located in, there actually is no stock.csv file. So when we go to open this file, we should get an error from PHP. And so we should say there is an error opening this path. And if we actually go and look at the end of the script, just refresh it just to make sure, we can see at the bottom here it says, warning, fopen on stock.csv, it failed to open. Basically, the file doesn't exist. and then we have our output message that says there is an error opening stock.csv. Now, one thing that's typically used here, because we've actually generated our own sort of error output message here, we don't really want that. Typically, don't want this PHP warning to be output. It's kind of ugly, and it doesn't provide a good user experience. So we're going to make use of the error suppression operator, the @ which is the @ symbol, and we're going to prepend that to the fopen function that's going to generate this error, so that when we reload our page, the PHP warning is not going to be output, and we're just going to have output our own error message. And basically, anytime we're going to be using fopen in this course, and as you'll pretty much see it, anytime you see fopen used, it'll be prepended with that error suppression operator, so that if there's an error opening that file, it doesn't output the ugly error message to your user's output. So now something I want to talk about is a file pointer. And basically, it's kind of like an array cursor, which we learned about in the introductory course. And basically what it is it's a cursor that is used to basically keep track of the current character being accessed in a file. For example, if we have a file down here that has these 3 lines, which is a number of different characters separated by, there's actually hidden new line characters here. Basically, when we're reading to or writing from a file, we read to or write from a file based on the location of the file pointer. For example, when we open a file using fopen with the R access mode, it opens the file for reading, and it places the file cursor here at the beginning of the file. So when we go to read, for example, the first 4 characters from this file, it's going to read from the current file pointer. It's going to read up to here, the first 4 characters. Now, for example, let's say there's different functions for moving this cursor around. Let's say that the file pointer was actually down here before this I character. Now when we read 4 characters, it's actually going to read these 4 characters here, IS space and L. So basically, the file pointer is what's used to read from a file, and also if we're going to write to a file, when you write to a file, it's going to write wherever that current location of the file pointer is. And one thing to note is that sometimes you'll hear file handles referred to as file pointers, and that's commonly used. In this course, we're going to distinguish between a file handle and a file pointer to make it easier to understand, so there's less confusion, because typically or often they're both referred to as file pointers. So for this course, we're going to use file handle to refer to the handle or the connection to an open file, and then a file pointer to refer to basically the cursor that you use to access data within a file via reads or writes. So the first function we're going to introduce for reading from a file is called fgets. And what it does is it reads the contents of the current line of a file. So wherever the file pointer is, whatever line it's on, it reads out the contents of that file. And if it's the cursor's that pointer is in the middle of the line, it just reads from wherever that pointer is until the end of the line. The other thing that it does is it, after it reads the contents of the line, it actually advances the file pointer to the beginning of the next line. So let's take a look at the fgets function in action. We have a file called fgets.php, and we have a similar code to what we had in the last example, fopen.php. We define a relative path to this stock.txt file. We open the file for reading, which is we're using the R access mode, which is going to place the file pointer at the beginning of the file, so it'll be at the very beginning of the first line. You can see we have the error suppression operator here, which is going to suppress any error if, for example, PHP can't find this stock.txt file. If there is an error opening the file, we output an error message. If not, we move forward, and then what we do is we call the fgets method. And what the fgets method does is it takes at least one required parameter that is the handle to the file that you want to read the current line from. So basically, when we call fgets and pass it file handle, because file handle hasn't been used by any other, for example, read or write functions, and we open the file with this R access mode, when you call fgets for the first time on a file handle, it's going to read the first line of the file. So what we do is we call fgets on the file handle, and we store that contents of that first line in this variable line, and then we output contents of the first line are whatever is stored in that variable. If we go and view this script in our browser, we go to fgets, we can see The output says contents of the first line is 1001:5. And if we actually go back and look at stock.txt, we can see that that's the contents of the first line in the file. So that's how you use fgets to read a line from a file. And typically, you don't just want to read the first line of a file. You want to read multiple lines in a file, or even all the lines in a file. And one thing that's commonly used with fgets is another function called fe of f. And what that allows you to do is test to see if the file pointer is at the end of the file. So for example, if you want to read all of the different lines in a file and then stop reading from that file when you reach the end of the file, you use this fe of f function to let you know to stop reading lines because you're at the end of the file. And just so you know, e of f stands for end of the file, and it's commonly used to refer to when you've reached the end of a particular file. So if we go and look at a new piece of code called feof.php, feof.php, what we're going to do is actually loop over all of the lines in that stock.txt file and output them. So here we've defined the relative path to the file. We've opened it using fopen. And then what we've done is we've created a loop that says as long as fe of f on this file handle, on this file that we've opened, is not true, meaning that it's not the end of the file yet, it's going to continue to go through this loop. And what it does is when it enters into the loop, the first time it's going to evaluate this test condition, feof is going to return false because it's not at the end of the file. So not false is true. We're going to enter the while loop. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get the current line in the file. So this is going to, the first time we go through this, it's going to get the contents of the first line in the file. Then what we're doing is simply outputting the line number of the file with the contents of that line. And in order to do that, we've actually defined a line num variable, which is sort of like a loop counter that we're going to use to keep track of the line number. Then after it's output that line, it's going to increment the line number. It's going to go back to the test condition of the while loop, and it's going to say, are we at the end of the file yet? In this case, because our file, as you've seen, has 3 lines in it, it's going to say, no, we're not at the end of the file, so we're going to run the loop again. And we're going to test, and we're going to go ahead and read the line and output it. In this case, it's going to happen several times, and it's going to output each line of the file. So if we go and look at the results of this, and we go to feof.php, we can see it outputs line 1 equals 1000:5. It outputs line 2, line 3. And also you can see it actually tried to output a line 4. So you can see that it actually entered this loop a 4th time, but when it tried to output line, there was nothing there. Well, actually, the reason that happened is because in stock.txt, there's actually 4 lines, because at the end of this 3rd line, there's actually a new line character, which makes it line 4. So when feof is testing this file to see if it's at the end of the file, after it reads this 3rd line, it's going to come down here to this next line, and it's going to see that it's not at the end of the file because there's still a new line there, and it's going to read the contents of that new line. In this case, the new line has nothing on it, which is why it outputs nothing. So that's one thing you have to be careful of, either by not including a new line at the end of your data files, or testing for that condition, which is something we're going to show in an example in a minute. So as mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, there's sort of a 3-step process for file I/O in PHP, or pretty much in most programming languages. You open the file, you perform any read or writes that you need to on it, and then you close the file. So in this slide, we're going to talk about fclose, which is the analog to fopen, and it's used to basically close the connection to an open file. And the way you do that is you pass it a handle to an open file as its parameter, and what happens is fclose goes ahead and closes that file. Now, some people don't always close a file after they're done using it, but it's a recommended practice that you always close any files that you've opened in your code, and also do so as soon as you're done using the file. And part of the reason for that is something known as file locking. Typically on a computer, only one process or program can basically access a file at the same time. So if you have a file open, if you've opened it and you're doing a bunch of processing on it, you've stopped processing and you go off and do a bunch of other stuff but haven't closed it, then any other program on the computer trying to access that file is not going to be able to. So that's one of the main reasons for always closing a file when you're done with it and doing it as soon as possible, so that it's free for any other process to use. So let's take a look at our another code example called fclose.php, and basically what this sort of does is completes this loop, these three-step loop. We open our file using fopen, the same file as before. We loop over each line of the file, outputting it. We read each line of that file and then output that line's contents. And then here you can see we use the fclose method. We've just finished using the file for all the reads that we need to, so we want to close it right away. And basically fclose returns true or false depending on whether it was able to successfully close the file or not. So based on that return message, we're going to say return value. If it was successfully closed, we're going to say the file rel path was successfully closed. If not, we're going to say there was an error closing it. So if we go and look at fclose.php and we view it, we can see it outputs different lines of the file. You'll see here it still outputs line 4 because we have that new line in the file. And then it's going to output the message at the end, the file data/stock.txt was successfully closed. And so that's an example of using the fclose method. Now we're going to take a look at a little more sort of real-world example on a file called currentstock.php. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to read this stock.txt file, and it's going to output for the user all of the current stock of each item number in the store. So for example, in this file, basically the way stock.txt is set up is the first part of each line is an item number of an item in this fictitious store, for example. And then it's a colon is entered, and then after the colon is the current stock of the item. So for example, and we do that for each, and we put each item and its current stock on a new line in our stock.txt file. So for example, this file states that there are currently five items with item ID 1001 currently in stock. It's out of stock of item 1002 because the quantity here is 0, and it has 24 currently of item 1003. So what we do in this current stock.php script is we open for reading this stock.txt file, and what we do is we are going to loop over each line of the file using this feff test function, and at each line that we're going to go to, we're going to read that line using the fgets method. What that's going to do is return, for example, when we read the first line, 1001:5. Now what we want to do is separate that information out into something useful. We want to separate it out into an item ID and the current stock. So we're going to use the explode function and use the specify that we're going to be using the colon as the delimiter, and we're going to say basically take this line, this string that we read from the file, and separate it into parts based on where the colon is. So the first part, and it's going to generate an array, and the first part of that array, or the value at the 0 index of that array, is going to be the item ID, and the value at the next index, the 1 index, is going to be the current stock. So here we do a little test that says if if the length of line array is not equal to 2, then continue processing the next line. And basically this is our sort of like way of correcting for when we reach this fourth line here, instead of actually outputting the stock for this line that is for an item that doesn't exist, it's going to say when it tries to, basically when it reads this line and it runs explode on it, there's no colon, it's not going to return an array that's of size 2, so we're going to just say skip over processing it, and that way that empty line doesn't get output. Now, if the array does equal 2 in size, then we're going to extract the item ID and current stock amount from the array, and here we're just creating some short variables. We're going to say item ID is equal to the value of the array at the 0 index, and the current stock is equal to the value of the array at the 1 index. And then we're just going to output a line that says item ID, it has so-and-so items in stock based on what was in the file. We're going to do that for each of the items in the file, and then what we're going to do is close the file using the fclose method, and if there's an error, we're going to generate an error message that says there was an error generating the code. So if we go and look at this file, currentstock.php, we can see that it read over the file, and it said item 1001, there's 5 in stock. Item 1002 is 0 in stock. Item 3, there's 24 in stock. And so this is the output of this file. And one thing you'll notice is that it actually has put in stock on a separate line in this page. And if we look back here and we look at our string to output, we don't actually have a new line or a break in there. And so what's actually happening is an extra new line is getting into there, is being added to that. And because we're enclosing this output in the pre tag, it basically treats all new outputs the text as is. So if there's a new line character, it actually outputs it as a new line or makes it look like a break. So if we actually look at the source code here, we can see that after 5, there's actually a new line. Blow this up. See, after the 5, there's actually a new line in the code, and you can see in stock is on the separate line, is on a separate line. Similarly, when we process item 2 after 0, we can see that a new line is actually output. The reason for that is if we look at stock.txt, each of these lines has two parts. It has 1001, and then it has a colon, or it has the item ID, and then a colon, and then it has the current stock. But also, because there's actually a new line character here, which allows us to put the second item on the next line. So when explode actually runs on this line, it's actually going to return as the second element 5 in a new line character, which is why that new line character is going to show up. And so now we're going to talk about a way to basically get rid of that new line character. PHP provides a built-in function called trim, and it's often used, and basically what it does is it strips any white space from the beginning or end of a string, and it's often used to strip new line characters from lines read from a file. So what we're going to do, if we go back to current stock.php, and here when we get our line array, or excuse me, here when we get the current stock from this line array that we've created using the explode method, we're actually going to run the trim function on that array value. And what that's going to do is strip that new line character off of that particular line, off of that current stock, because when it reads this line, it reads, for example, the first line, it reads 5 and then a new line. Well, now when it gets that string here by a line array index 1, and we run trim on it, it's going to get rid of that new line, so all that's going to be left in that string is 5. So if we save this and we go and look at the file again, we're going to see that now that new line doesn't appear, and actually the string appears as we had written it, with in stock being on the same line. So it says item number 1001 has 5 in stock. And if we look at our source code, we can see that none of those, blow it up, that those new lines after the current stock don't appear anymore. And so typically, we're actually, anytime we're going to be reading stuff from a file, we're going to be running the trim command on it as well. So we're going to do that for item ID. In this case, it's not going to matter, but in some cases it does. So just as a good practice, when we read from a file and when we use, for example, this explode method, we're going to trim any data that we get. So if we just run it again, everything's going to look the same, but that's just sort of good practice. So for the homework challenge for today's course, I want you to do something similar to what we did in today's lecture. I want you to create a data file called users.txt, where each line is a comma delimited string. In our example in this course, in this lecture, we used a colon delimited string. A comma delimited string that represents the first name, last name, and email address of a user. And so, for example, one user in this data file might be represented like this: Tom, comma, Stevens. This is his first name. It's his last name, comma, tstevens@gmail.com. It's his email address. You won't see it here, but there will actually be a new line character. You'll go to a new line and add another first name, last name, and email address for a particular user. So go ahead and populate this file, users.txt, with several just fictitious users, just for use in this example. And then what I want you to do is, from PHP script, open this users.txt file, read each line, and then output, after reading each line, output the name of each user and the email address of each user. So you're going to have to make use of that explode command that we use in this thing. And also, I want you to make sure that you use all of the functions that we used in the course today. Use the fopen function to open the file, fgets to read a particular line, feof to test when you've reached looping over the lines in a file, fclose, which is important so that you close a particular file, and then use the trim function so that you don't have that error that we sort of saw when we read a line from our file in today's lecture, where it adds an extra new line to a string that it reads from a file. And test that example out on these on this test file that you create, and then see the name and email address output for each different user. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching Educator.com. Look forward to seeing you next time.